He didn't recognize a single face at the funeral, and that was the first thing that frightened him. William Ashford had come expecting a small affair, a handful of mourners, a modest chapel on the edge of the city, the kind of place where a woman who had cleaned other people's homes for 30 years might be laid to rest without much ceremony. He had come, if he was honest with himself, mostly out of guilt, to stand at the back, sign nothing, say nothing, leave before anyone thought to ask who he was. Instead, he stood frozen in a doorway that could not hold the people inside it. There were hundreds. They spilled out the doors and down the steps and across the gravel lot in the gray morning light. Old women in coats, worn thin at the elbows, men with rough, folded hands, and children. So many children, dozens of them, lined along the front pews in clothes that had been pressed with terrible care, their small faces streaked and silent. A boy near the front was holding a folded square of cloth against his chest, the way another child might hold a teddy bear. William's driver had pulled the black car to the curb 20 minutes earlier, and William had nearly told him to drive on. He owned the tallest building in this city. He had not been wrong about a person in 20 years. And 3 weeks ago, he had stood in his own kitchen and listened while Margaret Ellison was accused of theft. And he had said the only word that mattered. He had said nothing at all. Now she was dead, and a room full of strangers wept for her, and he could not understand why. What was it about this quiet woman, this woman who had folded his linens and never once held his gaze a second too long, that filled a chapel to its walls? Who were all these children, and why did every one of them look at her coffin the way a child looks at a door their mother has just walked through and closed? He did not know it yet. But before the sun went down that day, William Ashford would follow a single question to the end of a broken street, and what waited for him there would bring a man worth $400 million to his knees on a packed dirt floor. The Ashford name had meant something in this city for 3 generations. The tower on Meridian Street was the tallest thing for 40 miles. 41 floors of dark glass that turned gold at sunset. And from the corner office on the top floor, William could see all the way to the river and the low brown roofs beyond it that he had never once had reason to visit. He had built half of that skyline. He had buried his wife from a cathedral that held 1,000 people. He was, by every measure the world used to measure such things, a successful man. He was also, though he would not have said the word aloud, a hollow one. Eleanor had died 2 winters ago. But the truth was that William had begun dying long before that, 26 years before. On a spring afternoon, when a fever took their daughter in the span of 9 days, and a part of him simply closed like a hand and never opened again. They never had another child. Eleanor carried the grief in the open, the way some people do. William carried his the other way, locked it down, and built a tower on top of it. And somewhere in those years, he had quietly stopped believing that anyone's kindness was real. Everyone wanted something. Everyone always had. That was his flaw, though he called it wisdom. He had stopped being able to tell the difference between a careful man and a cold one. Margaret Ellison had cleaned his house for 11 years. He could not have told you the color of her eyes. He knew that she arrived before he woke and was gone before he returned, that the silver was always polished and the study always dustless, and that on the rare mornings their paths crossed, she said only "Good morning, Mr. Ashford," in a low, even voice, and went on with her work. She had a habit of folding cloth very slowly, smoothing each fold flat with the side of her hand before she made the next. He had noticed that once, and thought nothing of it. He thought nothing of her at all, which is the cruelest thing one person can do to another, and the most common. He had no idea that for the last 4 of those 11 years, the woman folding his linens had been carrying 5 children on a housekeeper's wage. The accusation came on a Thursday. It came, as these things do, with the appearance of overwhelming proof. Beatrice Vance had run the Ashford household for 6 years, and she ran it the way a warden runs a yard: clipboards, inventories, a tight smile, and a memory for other people's failings. It was Beatrice who summoned William to the kitchen that evening. Beatrice who had assembled the staff in a half-circle like a jury. Beatrice who held up the ledger and the grainy printouts from the camera over the pantry door. "I didn't want to believe it either, sir," she said, and her voice was full of a sorrow she did not feel. "But the numbers don't lie. 3 months of missing inventory. Every shortage on a night she closed the kitchen. And the footage," she tapped the printout, "is the footage." The footage showed Margaret, in her gray uniform, wrapping food at the counter after the others had gone. Bread, a roast that had not been touched, containers of soup ladled from the pot that would otherwise have been poured down the drain. Night after night, the same. The cook looked at the floor. The young housemaids looked at each other. Old Harold, the groundskeeper who had been at the estate longer than any of them, stood very still by the door with his cap in his hands, and said nothing, though his jaw was working, as if he were chewing on a word he could not afford to spit out. "Well," William said. He felt the old familiar coldness move through him, the relief almost, of having a thing confirmed that he had always half believed about the whole human race. "Is it true?" Margaret Ellison set down the towel she had been folding. She did not flinch. She did not look at the floor like the others. She looked straight at him, and for the first time in 11 years he saw the color of her eyes, which were a steady gray-brown, and entirely unafraid. "It is true that I take food home, Mr. Ashford," she said. "Every night that there is food that would be thrown away, I take it." A small noise went through the kitchen. Beatrice's smile tightened with satisfaction. "There," Beatrice said, from her own mouth. But Margaret had not finished, and she did not raise her voice. And that was somehow worse than if she had screamed. "You're welcome to weigh everything that leaves this kitchen, Mr. Ashford," she said, quietly, looking only at him. "Weigh every loaf, count every spoon. But there is no scale in this house that can measure what I carry out of it. And if you put me out tonight on the strength of a ledger, that will tell the world a great deal about this house, and nothing at all about me." The kitchen was silent. The clock over the stove ticked. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and it felt like a year. And then William Ashford, who had been wrong about a person exactly once in 20 years, and did not yet know it, looked away from those steady eyes, because they made him uncomfortable, and he said the words that he would spend the rest of his life trying to unsay. "Pay her what she's owed," he said to Beatrice, "and see her out." He did not watch her go. He turned and walked back through the long hall to his study, and he poured himself a drink, and he told himself he had done the necessary thing. A man cannot run a house on sentiment. A man cannot afford to be soft. He had learned that the hard way, a long time ago, in a hospital room, with a small, still hand cooling in his own. He did not hear what Margaret said to old Harold at the service door, though Harold would repeat it to him later, and it would be the second sentence that brought William to his knees. He only heard the side door close. Quiet, final, like the last candle in a room going out. He never saw her again alive. The call came 3 weeks later, from a number he didn't know. A woman from a clinic on the south side. Margaret Ellison had collapsed. Her heart, the woman said gently, had simply stopped. Worn out, the doctor thought, by years of too much work and too little rest, and in these last weeks, by something the doctor could only call grief. There were arrangements being made. The woman wasn't sure why she was calling Mr. Ashford, except that his name and number had been written in the front of a worn notebook found in Margaret's coat, under a single line in careful handwriting. In case anything happens, he should know. He should know. William had stared at the phone for a long time after the woman hung up. He should know what? That she had died? Why on earth would she think he would care? And yet she had written his name. After everything. After he had stood in his own kitchen and let her be put out like a thief into the dark, she had written, in case anything happens, he should know. It was that line, and not guilt, that finally made him get in the car. And now he stood in the doorway of a chapel he could not enter, in a part of the city he had never seen, watching 1,000 strangers grieve a woman he had thrown away. And the only thing he understood with any certainty was that he understood nothing at all. He did not go in. He could not. He stood on the steps as the small procession carried the plain coffin out, and he watched the children follow it, 2 by 2, the oldest of them, a boy of perhaps 11 with serious dark eyes, leading a little girl by the hand. And when the cars pulled away toward the cemetery, William did a thing he had not planned, a thing he could not have explained to anyone, least of all himself. He told his driver to follow them, but not to the cemetery. He watched the boy. After the burial, after the long line of mourners had thinned and the strangers had drifted away, William watched the children climb into an old van driven by a woman with kind, tired eyes, and the van did not go toward the cemetery at all. It turned south, away from the city, toward the low brown roofs by the river that he had spent his whole life looking at from 41 floors up and had never once driven into. "Follow that van," William said, "and keep your distance." What he could not have explained was this. A question had its hand around his throat now, and it would not let go. Who were the children? Who were the children? Who were the children? And some animal instinct, older than his pride, told him that the answer was not at the cemetery. The answer was wherever those children were going home to. The answer was wherever Margaret Ellison had carried that wrapped food, night after night, while he sipped his drink and congratulated himself on his hard-won wisdom. The city changed around the car like a slow tide going out. First the glass towers fell away behind them, then the good shops, then the ordinary ones, then the shuttered ones with their windows soaped over. The wide boulevards narrowed and lost their trees. The asphalt grew cracked, then patched, then gave up entirely and surrendered to packed dirt that puffed up gray behind the van's tires. The streetlights stood farther and farther apart, leaning, half of them dark even now in the failing afternoon. William watched it all slide past the tinted window of a car that cost more than every house on these streets put together, and a strange shame began to crawl up the back of his neck, because his expensive car did not belong here, and his soft hands did not belong here, and the man inside them did not belong here, and he was beginning to suspect that he never had belonged anywhere worth belonging at all. He had built things in his life, bridges his firm had financed, towers his name was carved into, whole districts that had risen from nothing because William Ashford had decided they should. He had always believed, in the quiet, arrogant way of men who have never wanted for anything, that he understood the city he had helped to build. He understood, he had thought, how it all fit together, who lived where, and why, and what they were owed. He had been to charity galas in ballrooms that overlooked these very rooftops. He had given a great deal of money, over the years, to causes meant to help people he had never actually met, and he had felt, writing those checks, like a generous man. He understood now, watching the dirt rise gray behind the van, that he had never once driven down into the places his generosity was supposed to reach. He had given from the top of the tower, and the giving had let him stay there. The shame in his chest was not the clean shame of a single wrong. It was the slow, spreading shame of a whole life, lived 41 floors above the ground. The van turned down a street the GPs could not name. It was the kind of street where the pavement ended without warning and gave way to ruts, where the houses leaned into one another for support, where every roof wore the specific exhaustion of a structure that had been holding itself together through sheer stubbornness, for many more years than it had any right to. Somewhere a dog barked twice and gave up. A curtain made of a bedsheet shifted in a dark window and went still. The cold smelled of wood smoke and wet earth, and something frying far off, and it came in through the car's vents and would not be shut out. And William realized he could not remember the last time he had smelled the actual air of the city he owned so much of. At the very end of it, where the road simply stopped at a sagging fence, stood a house that should not have been standing. The walls were gray board, warped and gapped. The roof had been patched in 3 colors. One window was boarded over entirely, and another was covered with a sheet of plastic that breathed in and out in the wind like a lung. The yard was bare dirt, and on the front door, bright and absurd and brand new, hung a single heavy brass lock, the only new thing on the entire property. A lock that had cost more, William would later learn, than anything else the woman who lived there had ever owned. She had bought it the week she started bringing children home. To keep them safe. To keep the world that had failed them on the other side of the door. The van emptied. The children filed inside. The tired woman lingered a moment on the step, then drove away, and the house went quiet. And William sat in his car at the dark end of the dead street and did not know what to do. He should leave. There was nothing here for him. There was no possible reason for a man like him to be sitting outside a falling down house at the edge of the world. Instead, he got out of the car. He crossed the bare dirt yard as quietly as a man unused to quiet can. The boarded window had a gap where one plank had pulled loose, a sliver of warm yellow light leaking out into the cold blue dusk. And William, who had never in his life looked through another person's window, who would have had a man arrested for doing what he was about to do, leaned in close to that gap, because the question had its hand around his throat and would not let him do anything else. He heard the sound before he saw anything. That was the part he could never afterward describe to anyone, the part that undid him before his eyes had even adjusted. He heard a child's voice, high and easy and warm, float out through the gap in the boards, and it was the most ordinary sound in the world. A child saying a thing children say 1,000 times a day without thinking. And it went into William Ashford like a blade slipped between his ribs. "Sam, you're squishing the bread. Miss Margaret says you have to do it gentle." William's eyes found the gap and adjusted to the light, and then he saw. The room inside was small and clean and poor. There was no furniture to speak of. A low table that he slowly realized had been built out of flattened cardboard boxes and salvaged wood, with care, with corners that someone had tried to make square. There were beds along one wall, narrow ones, also built from boxes and board, and they had been made up with mismatched blankets folded into neat squares. On the table sat the food. He knew that food. He knew the very containers. It was the soup that would have gone down his drain. It was the bread that would have gone in his bin. It was the untouched roast that Beatrice Vance had counted in her ledger as theft. 5 children sat around that cardboard table, and a 6th, the serious boy from the funeral, the oldest, was carefully dividing the bread into 6 equal pieces, and giving the largest to the smallest child, and keeping the smallest piece for himself. And on the wall above the table, in a cheap frame, hung a photograph of Margaret Ellison, with all 5 children gathered against her, every one of them laughing, and a strip of black cloth had been tied across one corner of the frame. William's legs went strange beneath him. He gripped the rough edge of the boards to stay upright. Inside, the smallest girl, she could not have been more than 4, looked up from her bread at the older boy with a child's perfect, terrible directness. "Oliver," she said, "is Miss Margaret in heaven now?" The boy's hands went still on the bread. "Yes," he said, "she's in heaven now." "With my mom?" "Yes, with your mom." The little girl thought about this. Then she asked the question, that broke a $400 million man into pieces against the wall of a falling down house at the end of a dead street. "Does heaven have enough food?" she asked, "so she doesn't have to take any home anymore?" For a moment, no one inside the room spoke. The plastic on the broken window breathed in and out. And then the boy Oliver, 11 years old, who had carried the smallest piece of bread to his own plate, set down the loaf and answered in a voice far too steady for a child. She didn't take it for herself. He said quietly, to the little girl, to the room, to no one. She took it for us. Every night. She walked all this way in the dark so we wouldn't be hungry, and she got fired for it, and she never even told them why. Because she said, you don't explain the good you do. You just do it, and you let God keep the count. Outside, in the dark, William Ashford's knees buckled. He did not fall gracefully. He went down hard against the gray boards and slid until he was sitting in the cold dirt of that bare yard with his expensive coat in the dust. And he pressed his fist against his mouth so that the children would not hear the sound that was trying to come out of him. And it came out anyway, low and broken, the sound of a man weeping who has not wept in 26 years, not since a hospital room, not for anyone. And the sound shook him so hard he could not have stood if the house had caught fire. There is no scale in this house that can measure what I carry out of it. He understood now. God help him. He understood every word. And she was in the ground, and there was no scale anywhere on this earth that could weigh what he had done. How long he sat in the dirt, he did not know. When he finally got to his feet, the sky had gone fully dark, and his hands would not stop shaking, and he walked back to the car like a man recovering from an illness, and he sat behind the wheel and reached for the ignition, and he could not start the engine. His hand simply would not do it. He sat there, in the most expensive object on that entire street, and he could not make himself drive away from the children, because driving away was the thing he had already done to them once. He drove away anyway, but not home, and not for long. He drove straight to the estate, and he arrived after midnight, and he did not go to bed. He sat in his study until dawn with Margaret's notebook open in front of him, for the clinic had given it to him, the worn little book with his name in the front, and he read what was written in it, page after page in her careful hand. It was not a diary. It was an accounting, the real one. Every can of soup, every loaf, every roast, written down to the gram, and beside each entry, a name. Tuesday, bread, soup. Lucy ate 2 bowls. Oliver gave his to Sam again. Talked to him about it. Emma's cough better. 4 years of it. A ledger of love, kept by a woman who had been hanged on a ledger of theft, and on the last page, dated the day after he had let her be put out into the dark, a single line. It's all right. God keeps the count. The children are what I carry out. No camera could ever record it. William Ashford did not sleep. By the time the staff arrived the next morning, he was already standing in the kitchen, in the exact spot where he had stood 3 weeks before, and he had asked Harold, the groundskeeper, to gather every member of the household in a half circle, the same half circle, in the same room, and he had asked someone to bring him the full inventory. The real one. 6 years of it. Beatrice Vance came in last, brisk and smiling, her clipboard against her chest. You wanted the staff assembled, sir? Is there a problem? There's a problem, William said. His voice was very quiet now. He had learned, in one night, what quiet could do. 3 weeks ago, you stood in this room and showed me 3 months of missing inventory. You showed me footage of Margaret Ellison wrapping food that was going to be thrown away. You let me believe she was a thief. He set the ledgers down on the steel counter, side by side. But 3 months of shortages don't explain 6 years of them. Mrs. Vance and food that's already in the bin doesn't show up as a loss on a books. So I had the accounts pulled last night. The real losses in this house were never in the kitchen. They were in the purchasing. Suppliers paid for goods that never arrived. Invoices for silver, for wine, for repairs that were never made. £40,000 a year for 6 years. Signed off by exactly one person. The kitchen had gone silent. Beatrice's smile did not move, but her face beneath it had gone the color of ash. You needed someone to point at, William said. Someone quiet. Someone who actually did carry something out of this kitchen every night, so the footage would do your lying for you. You found the one honest person in this house, and you fed her to me to cover yourself. And I. His voice caught, and he let it, in front of all of them. I was so certain I knew what people were, that I never even asked her why. Mr. Ashford, Beatrice began. You can't possibly, Harold, William said. What did she say to you that night at the door? The old groundskeeper turned his cap in his rough hands. He had waited 3 weeks to say it. She said, he managed. Don't let him blame anyone else for it, Harold. It's not worth a job over. She was protecting you, he said to the cook, to the young maids, to the whole trembling room. She walked out a thief in everyone's eyes, so none of the rest of you would get pulled into it. That's the woman you all stood here and watched leave. The cook had begun to cry. One of the young maids put her hand over her mouth. William turned back to Beatrice Vance, and there was nothing cold in him now, and nothing soft either, only something terrible and clear. The police are already on their way, he said. Get your coat. You will be expelled from this house in front of every person who watched you destroy a better woman than you will ever be. Justice was witnessed when it was wrong. It will be witnessed now that it's right. And it was. She was led out the service door, past the half circle of staff, the same door Margaret had walked out of with her dignity intact, and Beatrice Vance walked out of it with none, and not one person in that kitchen looked away. But none of it brought Margaret back. William knew that. Punishing the guilty is not the same as honoring the good, and a man who has wasted a life cannot unwaste it. There was only one thing left that he could do, and it would not be enough, and he was going to do it anyway, for the rest of his own. He went back to the falling down house at the end of the dead street. This time he knocked on the door beneath the bright brass lock. The children were afraid of him at first, a tall, rich stranger in a dark coat, the kind of man their world had taught them to fear. But he sat down on the cardboard floor among them. This man, who sat on nothing lower than leather his whole adult life. And he stayed down there at their level. And he told them the truth in a low and steady voice that he had learned 3 nights ago from a woman through a gap in the boards. He told them that Miss Margaret had been the bravest, best person he had ever failed to see. He told them no one was ever going to be hungry in the dark again. And then he made them an offer. And it was not vague, because he had learned that vague offers are just guilt in a nicer coat. He bought the land their house stood on, and the land around it, and he tore down nothing he built. On the site of the crumbling house, at the end of the dead street, where 5 children had been kept alive on food a rich man threw away, he built a home. A real one, warm and bright and permanent, with proper beds and a proper table and a kitchen that would never, ever run out. He established it as a foundation in law, endowed for 100 years, with a single name carved into the stone above the door. And that name was not Ashford. It was the Margaret Ellison home. And below it, smaller, the words she had written in her notebook. No camera could ever record it. The 5 children were the first to live there, and Oliver, serious, steady Oliver, who had always taken the smallest piece, was given, when he was old enough, the right to run it himself. And the unpaved street got a name at last, because a street needs a name when a place worth finding stands at the end of it. On the night the home opened, they all sat down to eat together. The children, the tired, kind woman who drove the van, old Harold, who had finally said his piece, William himself at the foot of the table where Margaret should have sat. Former strangers, a new kind of family, built the way Margaret had built everything, out of what other people threw away, with corners someone had tried to make square. And as they bowed their heads, the candle in the center of the table, there was no draft. The windows were new and tight. Every person there would swear to it afterward. The candle flame leaned, slowly, all the way to one side, and held there for the length of a breath, as if someone unseen had passed close behind their chairs to see that the children were fed. Then it stood straight again and burned on. The little girl who had asked about heaven looked up at it and smiled, and did not need to ask anything at all. I don't know what you carry out of the places where you spend your days. I don't know whether anyone has ever counted you a thief for it, or whether anyone has ever bothered to ask you why. But if you have ever folded 1,000 other people's linens and gone home invisible, if you have ever given the largest piece of bread away and kept the smallest for yourself, and told no one, and let God keep the count, then I want you to know that someone saw you. Someone always sees in the end, even if they come to it 3 weeks too late and have to learn it sitting in the dirt. Because the measure of a life was never the height of the tower a person builds to hide inside, nor the weight of all they manage to keep. It is only ever the quiet weight of what they carry out to others in the dark, when no one is watching. And the truest fortune any soul can leave behind in this world is a room full of children who will grow up certain, to the marrow of their bones, that they were loved.